Well, good evening, folks. Welcome to the live broadcast of the Church Safety Guys. My name is James, and I will be joined tonight by Paul Buckner. He is actually setting up some equipment in the background, and our good buddy Michael Holland is actually on vacation this week, so we won't be bringing him in. But we appreciate you joining us. You're going to be with us hopefully for the next hour or so, and we're going to talk about a few church safety topics. Like we normally do. So if you just joined us, please feel free to click on the permission link above this live broadcast, because what that'll do is actually bring us in, and that'll actually give Facebook the permissions to bring your comments into our software, and then we can kind of take a look at what you say, and it kind of brings everything into our StreamYard software versus having to switch back and forth between that and Facebook. So you can always visit us on churchsafetyguys.com. And if you are watching this with us live, or if you watch it at a later time, feel free to go ahead and list the church that you're from and that location. And that kind of helps with our Facebook algorithms, making sure that we kind of spread the word about our group and about our live broadcast. So tonight we are actually going to talk about a interesting topic, kind of interesting to me, because I've kind of experienced some of it. But let me go ahead and bring Paul in here, and we'll see. Are you there?
Is that brighter?
Yeah, it looks a lot better.
Okay. Yeah, I've got it dimmed down just so it doesn't blind me. But so that you guys know, we've been having some lighting problems, and I think that may have been affecting some of the quality of the camera itself. So I have some lighting that you can't see off camera. It's going to help me with some of my video projects, which more and more is interview based and webinar based stuff. So this is good for me anyway. So anyway, I be here and you can see me. Yeah, that's my gesture.
Like what? Yeah, we're experimenting with new cameras and new tripods and new lighting and all that fun stuff, just to try and make it look a little bit more professional. So one of the topics that we're going to talk about tonight is actually emergency medical services, and also emergency municipal services. And we're going to focus a little bit specifically on dispatching and what happens when you call 911. And I know for a lot of you folks that are involved with safety or have been out there for a long period of time, this might seem kind of simple, but at the same time, what we've been trying to do is go through and really talk about things other than just active shooters and preparation for firearm stuff. And part of that is just because, I know so many people spend so much time on that topic that we want to kind of cover other topics and really reach out and say, hey, this might seem like a simple thing, but a lot of times people just don't understand it. And so this month we're going through, we're talking about that sort of thing today. I think next Sunday we're going to try, Lord willing, we're going to try and have a fire chief on with us. And we'll kind of go from there. But we've got some great things scheduled in March, just to give you a heads up on that. I believe the first Sunday in March, we're going to try and talk about the protection orders and restraining orders and that topic. We're going to hit on that a little bit. And we have a great guy joining us that has a lot of experience with that. March 8th, I will actually be broadcasting live from Wisconsin, from a church safety and symposium up there. And, we'll be able to interview a few folks and kind of go that distance, spend a little time up there in Green Bay, Wisconsin. Hopefully it's not too cold, right? I don't know.
It's Green Bay, so pretty sure June's like 28 degrees.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. But anyhow, and then after that, we're going to get into, in March, we're actually going to get into a topic that I've really wanted to get into, and that's executive protection and the application of executive protection with church leadership. And I know, like for Paul's done quite a bit of training extensively with folks that he knows in regards to that, and he's used that as a background. But it's a topic, protecting the leadership, the church leadership family, is a topic that we don't cover too often, and so that's one. That's one topic. I believe we're going to have Simon come in on that one with us and hang with us and chat a little bit about some of the things with that. So and just like any other Sunday night, if we're looking off screen or that sort of thing, it's basically because we're like pulling up our notes and trying to find that and trying to find where we're looking and all that great
stuff. And when I'm responding to people over here, that's because there's a big computer over here with multiple screens.
Well, and I have to keep telling myself, like, I'm used to looking like down here at the camera. So now I'm like, oh, okay. I'm stretching. You gotta love technology, right? So, all right. So talking about emergency services and dispatching emergency services. So starting off this evening, probably the first thing, if you're new to church safety, if you don't have a lot of experience with that, and your church is trying to start something, probably one of the best things you can do is actually go and chat with the local fire chief, or if you're in a bigger area, maybe public relations, they'll have somebody that they can work with you. If it's a smaller community, then a lot of times it's a simple phone call to just say, hey, who covers, how is your business model? How does your model function with emergency services? And who covers where I live, or who covers where my church is? And that's really probably one of the simplest ways to just kind of say, okay, this is who I would expect responding under normal circumstances, and you're good to go. So I would say probably the second thing that I would mention would be understanding what kind of model your area response team uses. Many units across the country use a mutual aid system or mutual aid network. And basically what that is several towns will funnel resources, to respond to each other's needs when there's a big fire, or if there is a big emergency that requires multiple resources. And I mean, honestly, a lot of times that kind of comes down to where you are. So where I live compared to like where Paul lives, I'm closer to a more metropolitan area, even though I'm kind of like on the outskirts of Columbus.
How many people live in Columbus?
A lot.
There's fewer than 25,000 people in my entire county. So yes, we are rural.
We have, I think in the borough that I live in, I think we're at about 65,000. And we're considered unincorporated Columbus, which means that we have Columbus municipal services, but we pay other taxes and use other school districts. So it kind of just depends on where you are. But in a more rural community, what I grew up in, and also what I worked, I served for 10 years as a firefighter EMT. In that area that I worked in, it was very rural, much like your area, Paul. So, you would have from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. during the day, you may have another town over actually covering, because there wasn't enough people in that town to actually get together and respond and cover that.
We call that county coverage here, where maybe your town rolls up at night and they've got 3 to 5 officers on the entire force, and so they go under county coverage at night or part of the night. So and that, to your point, at that point, the person that pulls up to your door is not going to know your streets. It's going to take them longer to get there. They're not going to know your family. They're not going to know the history. Yeah, so it's gonna work. Yeah.
And that makes it challenging, honestly, because a lot of times, you do know you do know people, or you know where they live. I can remember when I was really little, before I got involved in EMS and fire. My grandmother came and lived with us for a little bit, and she fell down our basement stairs.
Mm.
And so we had to call a rescue squad and an ambulance and that sort of thing. And that was kind of my first introduction to EMS, as a whole. And, I mean, it had a life-changing impact on me. But basically, when the rescue squad got there, they said, I don't know, like the rescue captain walked in, and he's like, I don't know any McGarveys in this area. And he's like, you know what? He's like, Floyd and Hazel Sears used to live in this house. This is the Sears house. So he's like, in the future, when you call and you ask for an ambulance, tell them, you need not an address. It wasn't this is, my address on this road. It was, tell the dispatcher to let us know it's at the Sears residence.
Wow.
And then, we'll make sure that we get here faster. And, well, and in my involvement over the years with the community, and the folks back home, I'm sure my dad and probably some of the folks I grew up with watch this at some point. They'll be laughing. But now it's kind of gotten to the point where, with my experience being in the community and before I moved out, I kind of had established, our name. So a lot of times now it's like, okay, it's the McGarvey house. Everybody knows where the McGarveys are, and, where they live and that sort of thing. So it's not really, and, we tend to forget very easily that technology in the non-developed areas hasn't actually exploded quite as much. And when I think about that, I think about the really limited time that a lot of places have even had the ability to call 911. Right. So, in a lot of more rural areas, they're still using, a standard telephone number to call into your local,
or the GPS dumps them off a quarter mile from the house, and they're sitting there at 5 streets from your lane going, okay, where is Pumpernickel Lane? I have no idea how to get there, because they don't drive that road, and GPS is way off.
So, I mean, honestly, the push of 911 in our community really changed a lot of things, because where I lived, it was, okay, Johnson Road can no longer be called Johnson Road because the Johnsons don't live there anymore. So what are we going to call this road? And for a long period of time, there was a lot of confusion, because you would say, okay, respond to, Johnson Road. Oh, wait, no, respond to Center Road or Center Drive or something like that. And you think about it, and obviously there were concerns. I remember several situations that I responded to where I was newer, and they said something like that, respond to Johnson Road. And I'm like, I have no idea. I'm looking at a map and I can't find it. And of course, that's every first responder's nightmare, right? You're asking for help. You can't get there. You don't know where it is. And there was a few situations that I remember God giving me a lot of wisdom and a lot of insight, and a lot of calmness to be able to kind of handle that adrenaline, to deal with that, and be able to rush through some of that stuff.
I'm going to interrupt you for just a second, because for those of you guys who are watching at home, one of the things that you may not know about James's background is he's worked with fire and EMS in the past, and he's worked alongside and with his sheriff's department. But he also, and a lot of you guys won't know this, he's actually worked in dispatch. And so that is a background that a lot of us don't have. And I know dispatchers, and I know they have several pet peeves that I'm sure we're going to get to those. But it's remarkable where people don't know where they are and what have you. And so one of many things that is in James's tool bag that he brings to the table is he's worked in dispatch. And that's what excites me about this conversation tonight. When we were talking about, hey, I think it's time to talk about dispatch, James is like, well, that's one of the things I've done. And I'm like, he's like, he has this history.
I'll bring this beanie out. I'll put this hat on.
Yeah. He's been a sous chef, a male model. He's worked in construction. He's done high wire work, and he's been a dispatcher. Triple PhDs. But in seriousness,
They only have 2 PhDs. Come on.
but in seriousness, that's what excites me about this conversation. Is this is one of these things that we can talk about in house, and James brings a wealth of knowledge about dispatch, and that's what excites me about this. So he made meticulous notes. I'm bringing stories, and I'm looking forward to this conversation because I'm going to learn something. So anyway, back to you.
Well, it's funny you say that because I've had people literally hand me a phone and say, here, call 911 because you're better at it than I am. And I'm like, what?
Yep.
But no, I appreciate the sentiment of adding some of my information there. Mm-hmm. Honestly, one of the first jobs that I had out of high school was dispatching. I just actually dispatched for an ambulance company, and they were tied into a mutual aid system. And so, yeah, it was some of the stories I have and that sort of thing are pretty interesting. But a lot of times, and just to kind of go back to the mutual aid thing real quick, a lot of times, like where I am, townships cover. So you have a township that typically might cover like 2 or 3 towns. And then those communities pull their taxes in to get better equipment and state funding and that sort of thing. So the reason that I explain mutual aid system and kind of talk about that is because a lot of times when people pick up the phone and dial 911, it helps them understand why, even though there's a fire station 5 minutes down the road from the church, why it took 10 minutes to actually get, or 12 or 15 minutes to actually get emergency help at that location. And part of that is because, the station that's closest to you isn't always the station that is going to be responding.
Yeah.
A lot of times the station closest to you might be out on another call, or they may be, trying to help another area. And so typically the dispatcher looks at everything that's going on and, where vehicles are, where equipment is, calls that are coming in, what type of call it is, and kind of go from there. So let's jump into specifically calling 911, and then we can talk a little bit about like equipment response, like what they send out and what they look at and that sort of thing. So calling 911 has evolved. I mean, over the years, knowing where your location is probably one of the best things that you can do. And I say that, but I've been at my church before and I've pulled out my phone. This was years ago to call 911 and I couldn't remember the church address, right? Because my adrenaline, right. I mean, my adrenaline was, racing through me and I'm like, oh, what's the address? Oh yeah, it's, 4701 Winchester Pike. And so, I've kind of memorized that now, but we've also kind of gotten to the point where with our safety team where the person that's in the office that watches cameras and that sort of thing calls 911. That separates, some of my focus and anxiety and adrenaline. And I can say, hey, I need you to call 911. This is what we've got going on. And then I can focus on what I need to focus on, what we're dealing with. So from that standpoint, what do they ask for? Well, I mean, your basic information, they're going to want to know your location, what's going on, and they're going to want to know more specifically if the person is breathing or not breathing. If it's a medical emergency, if it's a fire, often they want to know the size. How big is it? What's going on? Is someone trying to extinguish it? Is the building being evacuated? And they're usually pretty good about walking you through, that information. One of the things that we've talked about, I think we talked about it last week a little bit with building safety, but one of the important things that we've come across is making sure that the outside and inside of your building is marked with lettering and numbers and that sort of thing, because for them, that's paramount, especially if you live in a more populated area for them, they know, okay, you asked me to respond to door A, I can go straight there. And, that's just good stuff. Helps them out. It doesn't seem like it helps them out. The other thing with that is maybe if you have extra people, send somebody out to meet them and bring them back, because they don't always know, the church like you do. We assume, oh, they pull up and they've been. It's just, you just never know. I mean, it could be another town responding. We've had that happen before, where another town responded to our church for something, and they're another town. They have no clue our building compared to, the fire station closest to us that responds to stuff. So,
I wanted to jump in there and go back really quick, because you made a great point about knowing where you are. You guys have heard me talk about when I was in Kansas City, Missouri, visiting family, and God put me in a place to help a guy. I literally got to see what panic and not being used to performing under those conditions did to an intelligent man that I'd never met before. And I literally told him the street corner that we were at, and he looked at me and nodded like it was in here. And the dispatcher said, 911, what's the address of your emergency? And he goes, I don't know. And it was funny, the fact that his friend had been electrocuted and was flopping literally on the ground. It would have been hysterical. I would have thought it was a joke in a movie, and it was a gig, something somebody did in a movie. And I know you've dealt with this, and it's like the joke where the blonde calls 911 and they're like, whatever they say to her, and she's like, we've got a fire, and they're like, how do we get there? And she's like, duh, big red truck. It was just one of those moments where the information he was giving was not helping. And so I looked at him and I said, we're at the corner of, and he stares at me blankly. And I lean forward to the phone, and she says, I need an exact address. And he goes, again, I don't know. And I look up, and framing his head are the the exact street address. But panic will do that. And so you're blessed at your church to have a central dispatcher who probably has your address taped to his or her monitor at church. And in an emergency, like if I'm the central dispatcher and I hear your wife just fell and she's hurt and she's not responding, my panic is going to go through the roof. And I can look down and go, we're at the corner of 123 Freedom Street. And so knowing where you are is paramount. And I literally have seen, I had a front row seat to somebody, and I truly believe, had I not been there, they couldn't have responded anywhere near as quickly, because the poor guy was completely out of his head. So anyway, I can't emphasize strongly enough, you have to know where you are.
Well, and we don't think about it too much, but that translates, having a hard time communicating that information translates into a delay, right? Mm-hmm. And so, and I've had that situation before where, I've had someone call and I'm saying, okay, sir, I need you to calm down, or ma'am, I need you to calm down and tell me, I need to ask you some questions. Can you tell me where you're located? Don't assume that just because you're on a cell phone or that, I don't know, a TV show shows, instant GPS tracking and location that's the case. And again, honestly, I mean, our building has almost 26 doors to it. So me saying 123 Freedom Street, okay, I'm here. Now you've got a 180,000 square foot building. You've got a church. I drove by Nationwide Insurance building last night, and Columbus is a massive hub for Nationwide. And of course, on their main campus, they actually have signs out there that say EMS entrance this way. So when an ambulance pulls up, now, my first thought was, okay, do they get that many calls? Is insurance that stressful that but that's just, it's good planning on their part, because they can address it, and they can say, hey, you know what, this is where you go. We'll get you in from here. And it makes it less confusing and less frustrating. There's nothing more frustrating, honestly, from a first responder's perspective, than getting there and not having that information, because you're like, okay, I'm here, I can do something, but I can't do anything because my hands are tied, because I don't know which. And you think about it, I mean, honestly, if you're if you're on the other side of the church campus, other side of the building, and you start unloading your gurney, your bags, all of this stuff, and you truck it through the building when you could have just easily pulled around and gotten out and had everything right there. It's time and what it is. And I like to be my thing. And I don't know that I necessarily have so many pet peeves, but my thing about it was, tell me what I need to know. Is the person breathing? Is there, what's the injury? What's the extent of the injury? What's the extent of the fire? What do you need from me? Like, tell me exactly what you need. And so when I call, a lot of times I'll say, you know what, I need an officer and I need an ambulance, and this is why. And they'll say, okay, I'm an EMT. A lot of dispatchers are trained very well, in medical stuff. And they'll say, okay, we'll try and send, have you checked the breathing? Have you checked? And a lot of times I'll say, I used to be an EMT, and so I'll tell them very briefly, this is my history with it. And then they'll say, oh, okay, so check the breathing, check this, check that. And I'll say, yes, the person stopped breathing, or this is what's going on. But be specific. And it's very easy to be dramatic and try and eliminate that. If you have somebody on your safety team that tends to be very dramatic, you want to pull that away. And what I mean, and I don't mean to be rude or anything, but
true.
It should be, think about it this way. It should be less than a minute, less than 60 seconds. This is what I need. This is how I need it. This is where I need it. And that's it. Most recently, I had actually had to call an ambulance for someone in our church. And without getting into a whole lot of it, one of the things the dispatcher asked me was if it was because the person was lethargic and somewhat unresponsive. The dispatcher actually asked me, do you think drugs are a concern? And that was thrown out there. Hey, do you think drugs are a concern? Is an overdose a concern? And I said, no, because it wasn't, honestly. But in reality, I know, like for where we are, a lot of law enforcement officers now carry, opioid stuff to combat that. And they sometimes Narcan, different things like that. So they can respond faster and get it taken care of, and sometimes get there before the ambulance and that sort of thing. So
I want to go back on that and talk about that, because I can't emphasize how crucial it is to give people the right information. I have a loved one years ago. It took the ambulance 45 minutes to reach their house. Mm-hmm. And their loved one almost died. This is a family member of mine. They would have been better served by putting that person in their vehicle and driving them to the hospital. But I'm fairly certain, per my understanding of the story, that this was when 911 was just getting set up in our area. This was, I don't think 911 was actually officially up. And so, if you have to give directions and get somebody to the end of the road, and now we've got to worry about staging. And if you don't start, because, in a life-saving circumstance, and I can't emphasize that enough, this, James, very much so, seconds matter. Seconds matter. And so if they can get the right people on the phone immediately and say, okay, we've got at 123 Freedom Street, we've got a 54-year-old male. He's breathing but unresponsive. We suspect a heart attack. We need this ambulance en route now. Well, then they've got to get an officer, and the officer's got a stage. The officer has to get it plugged into their GPS. Hopefully the officer was not in the bathroom. The officer's got to be in their car. I mean, right? And all this stuff is true. And so then the ambulance has to wait, or the fire truck, because so many times EMTs and paramedics are on fire trucks these days, right? You mentioned that as well. What kind of vehicle responds, and you'll go into that. But all these things come in there, and then they've got to deal with traffic and goober smooches that won't pull over and get out of the way. So and you've been on that side of that too. And I've seen it from trying to direct traffic. So every one of these things, all of these things are things you can't control once you've made the call and given the right directions, but you can control how fast you got the information over and how clear and concise you were. Because whether it's a mass murderer or a building on fire or a unicorn has appeared in the middle of your sanctuary, you need somebody there now. Whatever the emergency is, you've got to start with the address, and then you've got to respond to their questions. And I've literally been with people that are talking. And there's one more thing I'll make, and then I'll throw it back to you. These two things drive me nuts. One is the dispatcher saying, "Sir, can you do me a favor and tell me, is there a medical history of here of anything?" And they're completely ignoring the dispatcher. Okay, that's garbage. And then the second one is, and this one drives me nuts, and I've had people look at me like I'm completely crazy. 2 to 5 people all dial 911 at the same time, and you're tying up dispatchers. And I literally looked up at a guy at an incident, and this guy is squared away over here, and he's giving great information. I mean, I swear this guy has a background, and he's just bam, 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 bam. And he sounds like the smooth sounds of a jazz DJ on the radio. There's nothing about this guy that's not squared away. And this person over here sounds like they inhale helium, and because their adrenaline's so jacked, and they're like, "I don't know what's going on, and I don't know where I am, and I can't." And I'm looking up. I'm like, "Sir, look at me. We already have this handled. I need you to hang up with 911." Well, they told me not to hang up. Let them know we have someone on hold, on the phone with 911. You're tying up 2 dispatchers needlessly, and they look at you like you're speaking Mandarin.
Right. Well, there's a couple of pet peeves in there. Now you're bringing back memories. So
trauma.
So let me jump back down to the 911 thing. What we told the people at our church was, if you don't get a response from us, call 911. I mean, we don't want somebody waiting, right, for the safety team to respond when it's a life threatening emergency. If the person's not breathing, if they're in cardiac arrest, if there's something significant, then obviously we want to get 911 started as fast as possible. So realistically, though, you're absolutely right. I mean, you don't have to have that many people calling. You don't have to have that many people tying up that information. We've been indoctrinated with the idea that we stay on 911 until the dispatcher tells us to hang up, or the first fire truck shows up, or that sort of thing. And that's just not realistic anymore. I mean, honestly, yes, you can give them information, and yes, they'll tell you, okay, we've got units responding. But I can tell you, if the dispatcher is a dispatcher for like Columbus, like a giant city, they're going to hang up, right? They're going to say, okay, you know what, we got your message. Thanks for calling. We have an officer en route. We have fire EMS en route. Go look for them, or that sort of thing. So because they've got so many calls coming in, they just want to do that. But I would say, honestly, that's kind of part of the job. Now, responding, you have to also realize that what you hear, what you're dispatched to, and this is probably just Murphy's Law. And if there's anybody watching this that has been in EMS or fire or even law enforcement, what you're dispatched to is never what you get when you get there, right? So when you show up, I've been in situations where I've been dispatched to chest pain, and show up that somebody has a gunshot wound, and it's like, and it wasn't even in their chests, right? So you can't even say. So yeah, so a lot of times when that person is freaking out, and not being able to kind of articulate what's going on and that sort of thing, I feel bad for the dispatchers, because a lot of times they'll say, well, okay, it sounded like they were having chest pain, but I don't really know. So a lot of times, one of our things that we used to hate beyond anything else was a medical emergency, because we would get dispatched to, again, 123 Freedom Drive, right, for a medical emergency. And you don't have the time, you don't have the ability to actually think through and prepare yourself and say, okay, a medical emergency means it could be anything from a paper cut to full-blown cardiac arrest, where you walk in and you're like, okay, they're doing CPR on this person, so we need to, shake a leg and get them transported and stuff. So it's hard. I will say, as far as kind of shifting gears a little bit to equipment, you're absolutely right. You mentioned an individual putting them in the car and taking them. Yeah, I mean, there have been situations where that's the fastest. Now, that being said, from 30 years ago, we have evolved considerably with the equipment that we have on those vehicles. So, when an ambulance pulls up where I am, the city of Columbus actually on their ambulances actually have, in some cases, more equipment than a local urgent care or emergency room. So if an ambulance pulls up, it's like, okay, I'd rather in that 6 minute. I think our time is actually 8 minutes in the city of Columbus, which is again phenomenal. I think the national average is 30 to 45 minutes. So that not every place has an 8 minute response time, right? But even at 8 minutes, when you're dealing with a life threatening situation, I would rather have an emergency room sitting outside my driveway than deal with, okay, I'm going to get him in the car in traffic and try and take him over here and all of that stuff. So a lot of times, it just depends on the situation and what's going on. I know typically if it's life threatening or if there's a concern about breathing, shock, something like that, honestly, you're better off calling 911, getting an ambulance there. And, again, the reality is most agencies will get there. They'll do a quick primary and secondary, review of what's going on. And at that point, if the individual is doing okay, they will trust me, they will tell you. I've had a call for things in my home before. And, we had one ambulance respond and they came in and they checked out the individual. And then they said, you know what, you could probably just transport them over to the emergency room and they'd be fine. And so at that point, I said, okay, that's fine. I just want to make sure. And the individual or the EMT that was there, the medic that was there said, we can transport if you want, but I'm telling you right now, it's probably going to cost you about $1,000. And so, at that point, I'm like, oh, okay, well, thanks for the heads up. Yeah, I'll take my car. And they know that though. And that's the thing, you're always better off calling and getting backup and help and, support for something serious than not and trying to waste time and juggle that.
So I wanted to jump in there because you make great points. If it's one of these things where, and you have to make a judgment call, and I think this is where the teacher will see medical classes, the stop the bleed medical classes come into play. And if you have a medical professional that looks at you and goes, we don't have time to wait, then right. we have to lean on their knowledge. And if you have an ambulance barn that's like where I used to go to church, it was less than a 2-minute drive. There were cases that we had people that would actually rush their loved one to the ambulance barn while dialing 911. So the ambulance literally rolled out, put the person in, and then took them to the hospital. That's not a bad idea if you can safely move the person depending on the level of the emergency. Now, and I'll give you two different extremes. I was with a friend of mine in law enforcement. He got his hand broken in a fight with a guy that was high on meth and hard alcohol. And so this young man is standing there and his fingers look like they'd been through a blender. They're all splayed everywhere. And the paramedics in the ambulance came up and looked at everything. And I actually looked worse than he did because I was covered in the bad guy's blood. It was quite the evening. But the end result of it was a party, let me tell you. But the thing that was interesting was they looked him over and they did just what you said, James. They said, honestly, you don't want us to transport you. You don't need us. And so I actually was honored. The chief of police looked at me and goes, take him in his squad car back to the station, get him out of his gear, all of his battle rattle, and get him to the hospital. And he knew I would take care of him. And so I was honored to take him up. He was in a lot of pain. Right. And then on the flip side of that, we actually had a thing where I was doing security for and also kind of there for a little bit of medical at an event where there was a lot of people shooting. It's in a very rural range, and the GPS drops you off a quarter mile from the range and goes, "You've arrived." No, you haven't, and you can't see where you're going. It's wooded, right. And so and here's Murphy's Law: the most squared away person medically there tripped on a root, fell on his shoulder, separated his shoulder, and required surgery. And was in agony. And he comes walking up to me, and his shoulder's here. Like, and he's not, I mean, like he's messed up. This guy is not in a good place and he's in shock. And so he's like, yeah, guys, I hurt myself. And I think I'm going to drive myself to the hospital. I'm like, no. And I had to talk him out of it. And then I drove him to the hospital. Well, there was 1 bar of cell signal if you like held the phone just right and you were on 1 foot. And
Sure.
so we got him out. And then there's the other rub with taking people to the hospital. When you go really, really fast down highways, you get pulled over. This is just, it's pretty universal. And so we're flying an undisclosed number of miles an hour over the posted state highway speed limit in my state.
Right.
And I said, we're totally getting pulled over. And I warned the guy, I said, understand this. If you pass out on me, you're waking up in an ambulance. And so he was trying his best to stay awake. I'm driving his truck and we're prayerfully weaving through traffic. And we get pulled over by a Missouri State Highway Patrolman. So I stick my hands out the windows. I got to do this where the camera can see me, way out the window. And the officer stops and looks at me. And I said, sir, and he was a retired sheriff's deputy. I said, sir, I have an injured retired sheriff's deputy in this vehicle. I'm trying to get him to the hospital. He's injured. And he runs up to that window. The guy gets the window down. They talk. This still took 60 seconds to get back on the road. And so where we were, and again, so this is where it falls on your training and the incident, and then how far are you from help? There is no way an ambulance, given a week of Sundays, would have found us because of where we were. And so we got him to the hospital, and we were able to give him the help he needed. And he later got a hold of me and said, hey, brother, I just want to let you know I'm back home and I'm on meds, and they've scheduled my surgery. And my concern was, did he have internal bleeding? And that was our big rub is he going to pass out driving himself to the hospital? Likely. 2, is he going to have internal bleeding from some broken bone inside? And is he actually going to bleed out on us if we wait for an ambulance? So those are extremes you have to come to your own conclusion on. Anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely spot on. A lot of bleeding and potentially with internal injuries, internal bleeding. A lot of times you'll see shock, and shock is the body shutting down extremities to basically either reset itself or supply blood to the crucial organs, right? So a lot of times when you see someone go, and this is what I say a lot of times in my classes, but if you see someone going into shock, that's a road you don't want to go down. So typically that would be the type of thing where you don't have a lot of time. You want to move people as quick as possible. But yeah, I mean, I could tell you a couple of stories where, in fact, I think I did a video, maybe one of my first videos ever. I don't remember, but I think I've told you the story about a guy. Before, it was right after the first Twin Tower bombings, before I think President Clinton was president, but back in the day. So everybody was on kind of high alert because, that a truck had driven under the Twin Towers and it had exploded. So a gentleman out in the middle of nowhere decided that on July 3rd, I think it's 1996, that he was going to make fireworks with black powder. And he was actually mixing black powder in a Maxwell House coffee can and with a wooden mortar. And he started doing one of these numbers, and he's like, oh, there's a chunk of black powder. I'm going to crush it with my mortar. Right. So what happened was he crushed it and it
blew up.
Yeah. And it blew out. He had a single story log cabin, about a 1,500 square foot cabin, blew the windows completely out of it. And so when the first fire engines rolled up on the scene, they didn't know anyone was still in it. This guy lived by himself. A neighbor about 8 miles down the road actually saw the flame and called 911. And so when the first engines rolled up on the scene, they said, we have a fully involved house fire. We're striking a second alarm, second and third alarm. So the fire department started responding, and as they were putting the first hoses on the building, this gentleman came walking out of the front door on his porch on fire. And so they put him out. And then long story short, we ended up actually life flighting him out of his front yard to basically save his life, because he had been holding the coffee can in his hand, and when it exploded, it took off several of his fingers, but it also blew into him, that metal shrapnel. So, I mean, but we were out in the middle of nowhere, and that was one of the things that we had. We ended up having, I think, 1 or 2 ambulances, heavy rescue there, etc. But we quickly said, you know what, if we don't call a helicopter in, this guy's going to die, because it was going to take us 45 minutes to get him to a hospital. And in 20 minutes, he could be at one of the premier trauma centers in New England. So we're like, okay, let's get it done.
Moral of the story is, don't create hand grenades and then slam them while holding them.
Yeah. I could probably take an hour show and talk about that story. That was pretty crazy. But moving on real quick, I just want to wrap up. We'll wrap up some of the equipment response, and we'll talk about that, and then kind of go from there. But a lot of times, one of the biggest questions I get, and I know I did a video probably a year or two ago about this, but one of the biggest questions that I get, like if I'm teaching a first aid class or that sort of thing, is, I have a medical emergency. Why did a fire truck show up? And, why did an engine show up? Well, you see that a lot in more developed communities like cities, right? But realistically, when you call 911, they separate two. Basically, they put that call into one of 2 categories, either a BLS category or an ALS category. And what that stands for is basic life support or advanced life support. Okay. They make a determination what category that falls into. Now, if you had a laceration, maybe chest pains, that would go in a basic life support category, where they look at it and they say, we don't really need that many resources. We'll just send an ambulance. So then they look at they pull up their map, they look at the closest ambulance that they can send, and they direct them there. On an ALS call, advanced life support call, that would be if somebody was unresponsive, maybe stopped breathing, something where the information that they received would indicate a very serious call, or like a stroke, or something where like CPR was in progress and they're doing compressions and they want extra help. So when that ALS type call comes in, at that point, they're just pulling resources from wherever they can, right, to get there as soon as possible. And we had a situation. I had a situation about 1.5 years ago where I had a gentleman collapse on me at church and stop breathing. And we called, and there was literally a fire truck right outside in front of our building driving by, and they got the call, and they didn't even have time to turn their lights on before pulling in.
Praise God.
So they came in, and of course, in that situation where we are, and it could vary depending on where you are in the country, and again, what equipment is available if you're in a rural area or not. But in our area, a fire engine has about half of the equipment that an ambulance does. So they'll have an AED, they'll have they cross-train firefighters with medics and that sort of thing. So they'll be able to start IVs and check out monitors and that sort of thing. So often what happens is they will send a fire truck, if they can send a fire truck because it's closer or it's right there. And then you've got 4 guys that can all of a sudden start care. And if it does go down a bad path where they're doing CPR compressions or that sort of thing, then those individuals will get on the ambulance and assist those guys when they get there. Because, and I'm sure you guys know this, but for folks that don't, CPR is very labor intensive. If you've ever had the chance to take a CPR class, it's very exhausting. So typically our ambulances around here with Columbus respond with 2 individuals, the driver and then the person that's in the back. And then, so that's just not, if it was life threatening or CPR or something like that, they just wouldn't have enough people to handle that, well, to the hospital. So that's why they send them. And then again, going back to what I mentioned earlier with the Narcan, several Columbus police officers now actually carry it on their car. And if something happens in their precinct, they've been trained on administering it. They'll show up because they can get there faster than the ambulance or fire department. And then they've got bragging rights. They won't say this because but it's the age old story of the police officers and the firefighters getting mad at each other and smack. Well, you guys just sit around and eat donuts all day. Well, you guys just sit around and watch TV all day. So, but yeah, that so just because you get a police car or a fire truck and you ask for the opposite doesn't necessarily mean that you're being ignored, right?
Yeah, but we actually have some guys here who are EMTs who are police officers, and they have some wild stories because they roll up on situations and have saved lives that by the grace of God they were there because they were the first responder, and they were able to get the bad guy in cuffs, get him down on the floor, or get him in the patrol car, and then effect medical care. And had they not been there, the person would have died. So I wanted to throw in a couple of comments and then toss it back to you. So Simon, who is a pretty exciting guy to get to know, and I've got to know him just a little bit. I've got to hear his faith story, which was awesome. I got to hear it, and I haven't had a chance to reply back to him and tell him that I've actually watched it. It was really cool. He made a comment, and I just want to kind of bullet point it, bracket it. He made a comment about having someone designated to call 911. So if you have a church like yours, James, that has someone designated to call 911, that's great. But I would emphasize that this is a huge thing to role play and actually to practice, because
absolutely,
even if, and this is something Matt Combs with Shield Force International talked about in his class I went to on advanced church security. He's like, even if the police officer is across the street and he's sitting there running traffic, right? Maybe he's inside taking a report on a burglary, and so he doesn't know there's an emergency. You've dialed 911, you've gone through everything. It's still going to take time for them to get it out over the radio, and it could be 4 or 5 minutes before that happens. And if you role play this and you have someone that has dispatch experience, and by the way, Simon, this might be an excellent video for down the road to actually show people how to role play this stuff out, because this is meat and potatoes of church safety. You guys that are ready for the meat, and you've squared away the radios and you've squared away the safety team and the basics of this, role play becomes huge. And so role playing out the actual dialogue. And in my area, sometimes we actually have police dispatchers that are off duty. A lot of times they're blue family. They're actually family of law enforcement that will come out and help you role play out over a cell phone connection. This is so crucial because the body cannot go where the mind has not been. And so Simon makes an excellent point about a designated 911 caller, but please make it multiple, because Murphy's Law, James is going to be the most squared away person, and the piano will have fallen on James, and he can't breathe. And so
thanks a lot, buddy.
Right? Right.
Well, I will say, to that point, you're absolutely right. One of the things that we've done and we've started doing is when we do training like active shooter or law enforcement training or any type of training, right? What we've added the component of the safety office dispatcher. So we'll put radios out, we'll have radios, but we'll do a legitimate thing. We've role played with law enforcement and said, okay, law enforcement, we've got an active shooter situation going on. We're training. The law enforcement does not walk in the building until they get a signal from our office person, and our office person actually went through those steps and called. And so, yeah, absolutely. It's hard. It's hard to recreate. It's hard to create a scenario with adrenaline where, you're trying to get somebody excited to the point of having the adrenaline going, but at the same time, you're trying to train them and that sort of thing. But to an extent, it's always good to, whenever you have an opportunity as a church to kind of incorporate everything into that and to say, okay, let's role play, let's do this training like it's a legitimate service or something like that, where you've got stuff going on in the office. And one of the things we started, like with that model, we started from day one really with having somebody that can control cameras and radio communication and all of that that sort of thing, and had that responsibility. But at the same time, nobody, we respect that individual. That's not for the faint at heart. A lot of times the folks that we put in the office, to me, that's crucial, because I could be dealing with something, out here in front of me, but they need to have it calm enough to be able to do all of that stuff in the background. Right. And so, realistically, one of our things is we try and get that person in a quiet place where there's not a lot of interruption. So, for the pastors that are listening to this, you don't want your camera communications area in a spot where there's a lot of noise. Everybody's walking around and interrupting, and they've got to scoot past the person and make the person move. And I mean, I know we have a lot of different size offices, safety offices. And I'm sure there are people be watching this that are like, you have a safety office? I don't have a safety office. Right. Yeah. So trust me, we had at one point in time, we had a secretary's desk, and then we went to a janitor's closet, and it got to the point where, thankfully we sat down with a blueprint and said, okay, we're going to build an actual office for the growth of the church. This is what we're going to do. So God blessed us with that. But from that period of being in the janitor's office, where we had like a 3x3 space, right? We told people, our instruction was, you grab your gear, you grab your radio, you leave them alone. Like, give them their space. Don't interrupt them. They're focused on the camera. They're focused on the radio communication. And so often, now that we've kind of graduated to a little bit bigger space, we do have a specific training program and guidelines that we use for those folks. So it's not, and like I said, don't treat that position like it's not important, because it is. It's not, oh, I'm going to send somebody to the office because they weren't working out with locking the doors, or watching behavioral signs and that sort of thing, or being out in the parking lot. It's, that person needs to be set well enough to communicate when bad things happen. And so you need to have just as much training for that individual to role play and go through what could possibly happen when you've got a Sunday school worker screaming into the radio, I need a safety person immediately because, this is what's going on. And so it definitely takes a special person to serve in that role. And so
I agree. And there's only one other thought I really had on that line, because you've really covered it well. And I actually did not know, you said it was it, and I'm going to say this wrong, was it BLS and ALS? Yeah, BLS and ALS. That's really cool, because that actually helps me to bracket things. I had a couple quick things. One gentleman mentioned, and I'll get his name here in a minute, but he mentioned something about abuse of 911. Well, obviously we don't want every time a squirrel scampers across the roof. So right. You can abuse 911. This is also a great reason that you should know your area's non-emergency number, i.e. Sure. Someone says, I'm not feeling well, and I think I'd like to lay down for a minute, and you could be like, this in emergency, but I'd like to have you guys standing by. Two, I've talked about this in a video recently where I read about a church, or heard about a church, that they didn't have any safety team. They didn't check on a lady that was leaving. She didn't feel well. A dozen steps from the front door. We talked about this last. She's face down the parking lot, and 40 church members find her dead in the parking lot. So following up with that is great. And then the third one I can think of is, and I dealt with this with a friend of mine. He had been Marine Special Forces, and he started having heart problems. He worked at a plant in my town, and I was, by the grace of God, I was down at the police station. I was doing some stuff with them early in the morning, and I hear it come over the radio, male, 54 years old, whatever, difficulties breathing, this, that, and the other. And I stopped and I went, that's so-and-so. And we later lost him, but unrelated to that. And I turned to one of the officers and I said, that's going to be so-and-so. He looked at me and he goes, you going with? And I'm like, you better believe I am. Well, I got there. He's a concealed carry permit holder. And so something to think about is, okay, so James, you're helping me. I'm on the floor. Something's wrong with me. My blood sugar's crashed. I've got bullet holes in me. I'm leaking blood. When this gets affected affected by trauma, whether my blood sugar's off and I go back to Vietnam and I'm fighting in Vietnam in my head,
Sure.
no pun intended. That's something that Skinny Medic talks about a lot and so I'm literally robbing him of this, but I'm going to give credit where credit's due. He talks about the fact that people, when they're in that situation and you're on the phone with 911, one of the things for weapons and relieving them, as Skinny Medic says in the Civilian Medical Podcast, of their toys. Because if I'm a trigger puller and my brain is not where it needs to be because I've leaked a third of my blood, you probably want to take my toy until a later date. And so having someone where you role play the 911 call and everything and you secure the toys, that creates a safe environment for law enforcement to come into and for the medical team to come into. And then you don't risk the fact of the firearm being lost or straight up stolen. And I hate to ever insinuate that somebody that's a first responder would steal, but I've been at wrecks where there was a first responder that was later arrested. He was stealing people's wallets. Straight up.
I mean, honestly, and you kind of made me think of a point with that, and something that you said about the lady walking outside. But the point about the firearm, absolutely, and it's not necessarily the first responder that you have to worry about, but it could be the other people around the church, right? So, I mean, because our church, our doors are always open. So, absolutely locking that up, grabbing that, securing it, and making sure that the scene is safe and that it's safe is a big deal. Going back to what you said about the lady walking outside. So one of the things that we do on a regular basis, and I would encourage churches to think about this, is if we monitor an individual, like we'll do a primary or secondary survey and try and dig into, okay, why are you feeling bad? It's not life threatening, but you're feeling kind of bad. We're not going to call an ambulance, but what's, maybe sugar's off, diabetic, what's the issue? One of the things that we talk about and we do is we will drive that person home. And so if we don't do that, then we will help them. We'll say, okay, is there someone that we can call, like your son or, a family member that can help you go home and get you squared away, but still check on you? And so, and there have been a few people, where I will go and I will call them later on, or I'll shoot them a message and say, hey, I'm just checking in on you to see how you're doing. And, or have, if it's a lady, have one of the ladies do that. And just kind of follow up to make sure that they're okay. Because absolutely, I mean, you don't want somebody to go home or even go out in the parking lot and have an issue with that. So a lot happens. I mean, churches are just hubs for activity. So when we look at that, when we talk about, okay, making sure that everybody stays safe, that is definitely something we have to consider and we have to talk about. So, other than that, I think hopefully we've covered that topic well. Hopefully, everyone understands well.
I do have one more brief thought, and then we should close in prayer. And you're welcome to close in prayer. You're welcome to throw it back at me. My wife's a nurse, and I'm really blessed to have a emergency experienced nurse. And as a spouse, that really is a blessing. You may be the person that's applying the medical care that you have, and somebody who's more qualified than you may come up, and you may take a step back and secure the scene or do crowd control in some way or secure the weapon, or they may say hold pressure here, and you may get downgraded, or they may be on the phone and actually hand you the phone, and now your job is to relay information. And in a non-emergency situation, because it's above my pay grade, I don't know how many times I have turned to somebody who is, I don't want to be a bother. I don't want to be a burden. I don't want to disturb anybody. But I was on the door watching the flock, and I realized, okay, doesn't look right in the form of a medical thing. They don't feel good. They're hurting. They're chicken winged a little bit, and they're moving out the door. And I'll step in and I would motion to my wife, or we had a couple other nurses in and around the church, and I'd just kind of a little quiet motion. I'd tap them on the shoulder, whatever, and I would have them walk out with me. And they would say, oh, I just want to walk you to your truck. And then they would visit with them. And of course, they will hold their hand. And, nurses are sneaky. They'll sit there and take your pulse. I got your hand up here. They'll take your pulse while they're holding their hand. They'll be patting your hand, but they're checking your pulse. And they'll look at you and go, and you can tell they're saying, call 911. And instead of going, oh my gosh, call 911, they're keeping the patient calm. And if you've got people that are squared away like this kind of falls under like the non-emergency number thing. If you're like, I don't know if this is an issue,
Right.
get someone who's medically qualified, and then they may look at you and go, call 911.
Yeah.
And they may mouth the words, or there's been things that I thought was straight up, sound the alarm. And my wife's looked at me like, no. And she'll take everything over. And I'm like, oh, okay. So anyway.
Well, and it's funny you say that, because absolutely, we've got some great ladies at our church that are nurses, and they don't typically help on the safety team often, but when bad things happen, a lot of times they magically appear, and it's awesome, because they'll come up to me and they'll say, do you need some help, or are you good? And I'm like, absolutely, I need your help. This is what I'd like you to do, But one thing you have to realize too, and I'll throw this out here, and then we can close in prayer. But one thing you have to realize is not every nurse, not every EMT, not every medic, not every doctor is equal, right? They're not all trained the same way. So you could be a nurse in a doctor's office and have someone that, obviously they go through a lot of the same training, but at the same time, what that person has dealt with for 20 years might not be the highly traumatic, trauma related situation that an EMT has, right? And so you have to kind of acknowledge that and kind of look at that as that what's going on may be out of the scope of the individual that's helping or trying to help. And when we first started our safety team, it was kind of more of a medical team than anything else. And there were times when, the ladies would be nurses, they would, look at somebody that was having a hard time breathing or that sort of thing. And they'd look back at me and they'd say, okay, what do you think? Should we call an ambulance or not? And so more often than not, I would say, okay, if you have a question in your mind, we should be calling an ambulance and getting them rolling here. But just to kind of throw that out there. So you could very easily, if you've done maybe you're not an EMS person and that's not your forte. Like, I know, Paul, you haven't done a tremendous amount of that, but you've done a lot of tactical training with, tourniquets and different things like that. So, and you've seen a lot. So your attitude about trying to step in and trying to help things and even having an attitude of common sense and, don't move somebody, try and hold head stabilization, keep people out of the scene. There's always something that you can do, but just kind of keep in mind that not everybody is equal with that stuff. So the experience that somebody has could be entirely different, and that could impact their reaction. And of course, I'd be amiss without saying that there are certain things that trigger for all of us. I don't consider that as a field that has PTSD. But I know that now, after years of talking about it and doing that, now they're starting to say that firefighters and EMS have that. And, I've never looked at it and said, oh my goodness, this is what I have. But, there are things that I've been to that I dealt with 30 years ago, almost 30 years ago, that still haunt me, right? I still have a question in my mind. Could I have done this different? Could I have handled this different? Would there possibly have been a different outcome? So keep in stride, but also remember there's a lot of things that, they kind of, I don't want to say set us off, but at the same time, we each have different reactions to it. In the field across the bar, people don't like dealing with children. If you have a situation with a child, it's more emotional for an adult. And then especially if you think about it, if you have a child and you're trying to take care of a child, that adds emotion to, okay, how do I best, help this child because something devastating is happening. So yeah, I mean, just you really kind of have to be patient with that and understanding too that, an emergency room doctor is going to have a different perspective on handling something like that than a family practice doctor. right? Because they deal with different things on a more consistent basis. So just food for thought.
Experience matters.
If you're trying to set up a safety team or a medical team, or you're separating teams and that sort of thing, you just, if somebody can, and here's what I would do, and I'll close it with this, I promise. But if somebody came up to me and said, I'm a doctor, I want to run a medical team or be in charge of it, I would ask them, okay, what type of doctor are you? And go through, because I've had, well, I'm a doctor of psychology. Well, what?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Probably not going to help.
That's a great place on a safety team, though. But at the same time, as far as counseling and de-escalating and that sort of thing, that's fantastic, right? That would be awesome to have. But that's probably not the person that you want over your medical team. A very well-trained nurse would probably do better or handle things better. And I'm being a little silly, but I'm throwing it out there, because a lot of times churches are like, well, hey, I want to set up a medical team and I want to do this. And we have a doctor. Well, have you spent a little time with him, asking him what his experience is? If he's an emergency room doctor, fantastic. If he's a pediatrician, yeah, maybe not, maybe he shouldn't be the one in charge. I had a third-year resident at Ohio State University. And when he's like, I want to help with your safety team. And I'm like, wow, okay. I'm like, what are you specializing in? And it was like internal organ distress or something like that. And I'm like, okay. But, yeah. Wow. So it's crazy. But anyhow,
it might not be a good call.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's go ahead and close it down. We'll close with prayer, and we appreciate you guys hanging with us. Thanks for watching. And as always, pray for us. Pray for the ministry. Again, we continue to do our thing, and some great things continue to happen. So, we're trusting that God leads with us, and that we have the opportunity to continue helping churches all over the U.S. And that's kind of our goal and mindset. And so we just want you guys to be blessed, and hopefully it's beneficial to you as well. So let's go ahead and close in prayer. Gracious Heavenly Father, I thank you for this evening. I thank you for the folks watching and those that will watch. God, I just ask that you be with them, bless them with this information, and just let it be of value to them. And just ask that as we go into the next week, that you would protect us all, keep us safe, and that for those of us that are running ministries or services or whatnot through the week, that you would continue with your hedge of protection around them and those ministries, and just give them wisdom on a daily basis. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen.